I'd like to welcome everyone here. I hope you all had a great weekend, to say the least. Sorry about the Patriots, but I hope people do believe in the Celtics. They had a great weekend, absolutely. I'm with you. I want to thank you for joining us today with what promises to be a very informative discussion on a very critical issue here in New England, and that is housing. It reminds me of the weather. It's a storm outside, and this is a storm of an issue, to say the least, affordable housing. But we're grateful for all of you to be here today. And speaking of grateful, we're incredibly grateful to Conifer Realty for sponsoring today's program. And in particular, I want to thank Sean Carpenter, the Regional Vice President of Development, who came to us with the idea for this event earlier this year. He's a graduate of UMass Dartmouth, and he's a graduate of UMass Boston. And he said, I want to have it here at the UMass Club. So his DNA is UMass. So I just want to thank him for his choice, too. For those of you not familiar with Conifer Realty, they are a leading developer of affordable housing and have recently expanded into the New England market. We're pleased to have them as a council member and grateful for their support today. And before I hand it over to Sean to introduce our very special guest, I'd like to thank all of you for your support and engagement in the New England Council over the course of the last year. Our chairman, when he indicated in his remarks at our annual dinner, he said between the second quarter of 22 to the present day, we did 103 in-person events in all over New England and in Washington. It's extraordinary. It's through your support. So we thank you. And we, believe it or not, we have our first event of the 24 already planned on January 16th. We will hear from the House Minority Whip, Catherine Clark, at a Capitol Hill Report breakfast here in Boston. Today, we are here to talk about one of the biggest challenges facing our region, and that is the shortage of affordable housing in the region. This is an issue that is not only having a direct impact on individuals and families throughout New England, but also on our region's economic competitiveness. Housing shortages are making it harder for employers in our region to attract and retain talent, and can also be a major impediment to businesses looking to locate or expand here in New England. The good news is we have leaders in government, in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector. We're working to address this challenge with innovative and collaborative solutions, and we are fortunate to be joined by some of them today. And as you know, our keynote speaker this morning is Senator Elizabeth Warren, who has been a champion for working families and a leader on the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. To introduce her, I'm pleased to hand it over to Sean Carpenter to give a very proper introduction.
Good morning. I send regrets from the president of Conifer, who's much more attractive than I, who could not be here this morning because he's stuck at Philly Airport, and all the Massport people are here, so they weren't going to allow the plane to land. So I want to just say it's really nice to be here amongst the business community and so many community leaders in a building, One Beacon, that's so special to me. About 23 years ago, I started working on the 28th floor of this building as an analyst at Mass Housing, a little-known agency that nobody knew at the time. I would commute in to Mass Housing with my father, who was the internal auditor downstairs, and we would drive from Auburn to Boston every morning at 6:30 a.m., and then it would get earlier and earlier every year as the Pike started backing up further and further. And now I understand it's like backed up from Auburn all the way into Boston. I moved to Quincy, so it's a little bit easier. Not long after that, I met my beautiful wife on the 29th floor of this building. And she's here today, and also a great champion of affordable housing, working with our partners at Boston Financial Investment Management. And there's more, of course, as Jim said. This club is important to me, and not just because it has the nicest and best lobster bisque in the city, but 25 years ago, I graduated from UMass Dartmouth And it was also the last time I introduced a U.S. Senator, Senator Ted Kennedy, and that was really a great honor at the time. And even this year, I went back to UMass Boston and got my MBA. So it's never too late to do that. But from kindergarten to my MBA, I'm a product of public education and really proud of it here in Massachusetts. A little over a year ago, I signed on with Conifer and started working on a plan to expand our development efforts in New England. Conifer has about 16,000 units on the East Coast, mostly in New York, New Jersey, and Maryland and Pennsylvania, and really had a vision to expand here in New England. And I signed on with them eager, as I had been working in the affordable housing business here in Massachusetts for about 25 years. In housing, we're constantly advocating for new housing opportunities, whether we're looking at developments on the South Shore. My friend John Iredale's here. We've done a couple of deals together on the South Shore with affordable housing. I wanted to point out my friend, the Sheriff of Norfolk County, Pat McDermott, is here. We've been talking about reentry housing at the jail and ways to do that and slow the rate of recidivism. Assisting other developers in New York and Rhode Island and Connecticut and my friends up in Sunday River. 1,500 employees work at that resort, and they have to commute all over Maine just to make snow so everybody here can have a great weekend of skiing. Conifer is a 50-year-old organization with a major presence here on the East Coast. Expanding here in New England could be a really daunting task. It was the vision of Conifer's leadership that led to the efforts to find ways to participate, initiate conversations of creative, affordable housing, creating new jobs and economic development opportunities in New England as our expansion territory. It is an honor today to join you in this important gathering focused on one of the most critical issues, as Jim said, facing our society, and that is affordable housing. The pursuit of affordable housing and the accessible housing is not just a policy goal. It's a fundamental commitment to the well-being and dignity of every individual and family. It's something that we at Conifer take very seriously. Conifer is committed to bringing innovative and socially responsible initiatives dedicated to addressing the challenges within our communities. And just last year, when the Biden administration signed the CHIPS Act, our Northeast team, based here in Boston, worked with local, state, and county officials in New York as Micron announced that they were going to bring 50,000 jobs to Syracuse. So over the course of the next few months, we acquired an old mall. We put plans together to develop 1,600 residential units, 300,000 square feet of retail, and 300,000 square feet of medical office, and a small micro-hospital, so that region can build and exceed. We're going to do the same thing here in New England, and that's why we're here today. And we all know that housing is not just a matter of shelter. It's a fundamental human right that underpins the well-being of our fellow citizens. I do want to mention my friend, the Dean, Reverend Amy McCreath, is here from the Cathedral of St. Paul, and the MANA program that they run there, a spiritual program for unhoused individuals. It's a phenomenal program, and you should check it out. And as Congress has done boldly since 1986, it now has an opportunity to once again address the crisis through the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. The legislation is not just policy. It's a promise to our communities, a continuation of the commitment to ensuring hardworking families can find a place to call home without sacrificing their financial stability, their health care, their child care, or their education. This act will usher in a massive economic boost of 3 million jobs, hundreds of thousands of new units of affordable, high-quality housing, and billions in wages and business income. It enhances the low-income housing tax credit, a proven and successful tool in promoting the development of affordable housing across the nation. Increasing allocation of these credits encourages private investment in affordable housing projects. This, in turn, stimulates economic growth, creates jobs, revitalizes communities that have long been neglected. It's an investment in our future, fostering the development of vibrant, sustainable neighborhoods where everyone has an opportunity to thrive. And again, supporting the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act is not just a matter of policy. It's a moral imperative. It sends a clear message that as a nation, we prioritize the basic human need for safe, affordable housing. It reflects our commitment to building a society where everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic status, has the opportunity to live with dignity and security, something we at Conifer hold very dearly. Passing the HCIA is the single most important act Congress could take to address our nation's affordable housing supply crisis and take a giant stride toward a future where the American dream is attainable for all. And so today, I am particularly delighted to have the opportunity to introduce a true champion of economic justice, a tireless advocate for affordable housing, someone who has dedicated her career to fighting for fairness, accountability, and welfare for all Americans. Senator Warren is a trailblazer in the world of politics, a powerful force for change, and a true advocate for the underrepresented. As a leading voice in the United States Senate, Senator Warren has consistently demonstrated a commitment to addressing the root causes of economic inequality, championing policies that aim to uplift those who need it. Her relentless pursuit of justice, paired with the passion for creating opportunity for every American and working with some of the most interesting individuals this country has ever seen, aligns seamlessly with the values we hold dear. Together with leaders like Senator Warren, we can forge a path towards a future where affordable housing is not just an aspiration, but a reality for every citizen. Please join me this morning in giving a warm welcome to Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Thank you. Oh, that's so nice. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sit down, sit down. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim, for getting us all together. Thank you, Sean, for doing this. And thank you to New England Council for hosting me this morning. I love to be here with you all to talk policy. You're my kind of people on that. Policy is my love language, so having a chance to engage in this conversation is terrific. You know, the last time we met, I was looking back at the speech, the last time we met, we discussed a range of issues that affect New England. We talked about infrastructure, the climate crisis, healthcare, civic engagement, and immigration. Today, at least I'm going to start this conversation, though, with just one topic that I want to dig in deep on, and that's housing. And I want to start with a nod to Sean's point. Yes, we need to pass the HCIA. I am all in. Let's get this done. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because that is not enough. That is just the minimum. That's what we need to do to get in the door. But we need to have a bigger, broader conversation about housing. And we need to focus as a group on how we can get more resources into housing to build out the housing supply we need. America's in the middle of a full-blown housing crisis. And there are a lot of ways to measure this crisis. I just pick a couple here. We don't have enough housing. Nationally, the United States is over 7 million housing units short of how many houses it takes to be able to house our people. Massachusetts is struggling. Experts estimate that we need about 175,000 new housing units right here in Massachusetts just to make sure that everyone has a place to call home. Now, the consequences of this housing shortage can be felt in a million ways. Here's one I picked. I actually did the research for this one online. 40 years ago, a Boston public school teacher, median earnings was about $17,600. A single-family home in Boston sold for $79,400. For the mathy among you, you would notice the cost of housing was about 4.5 times what a public school teacher made. That's how affordable housing was. Today, that same Boston public school teacher at the middle earns about $82,300, while that same single-family house in the region sells for about $900,000. 11 times a Boston public school teacher's salary. Housing feels unaffordable because it is unaffordable. And it isn't just homeowners. From 2020 to 2021, rent in Massachusetts jumped by a whopping 21%. The average home sale price in the same 2 years increased by nearly 30%. And with 30-year mortgage interest rates over 7%, the dream of owning a home is further and further out of reach for first-time home buyers. Those high interest rates also hit renters because both developers can't afford to build new apartments and landlords have to pay more on their mortgages. The cost of housing is now the largest contributor to inflation, accounting for over half of the monthly all items increase in the most recent Consumer Price Index. In other words, the problem is bad. And the problem is getting worse. Do you think housing is in short supply in Massachusetts right now? Do you think that rents are already rising like a hot air balloon? Well, buckle up for a rough ride. Experts tell us that to address the current housing shortage, we'll need to build as many as 200,000 new housing units in just the next 6 years. You know, I give you lots of numbers, but I want to put this a different way. When I meet with constituents from Boston to Pittsfield, out to the Cape, when I go north, when I go south, often the very first thing I hear is the cost of housing is just too high. And when I ask employers what their biggest challenge is, many mention that they can't find workers or they're having trouble attracting top talent because of the high cost of housing in our area. And there's one other aspect to the housing crisis that we just need to put up front. This is an equity issue. It's about racial equity and generational equity. Homeownership is one of the major ways that families build wealth. A mortgage is structured to become more affordable over time. As the payment stays level, incomes go up and inflation goes up. And that means the cost is relatively smaller for a family. Homeownership is the number one retirement plan in America. Pay off the house and live on Social Security. And the house is there to cash out if someone needs nursing home care at the end. And if Grandma and Grandpa are lucky enough to be able to stay in their home until they pass, they leave a nice nest egg that boosts the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that. For decades, our federal government subsidized housing. But because we did so at a time of racial redlining, which was then followed by a wave of predatory lending that wiped out many communities of color, those subsidies helped white families that bought homes and were able to prosper, while black families were often left out. And that racial tilt has not gone away. Today, the gap between black homeownership and white homeownership rates is the same as it was back before the 1965 civil rights laws were passed, the same as it was when Jim Crow strangled economic progress for African Americans. This is also a generational issue. Subsidies that prompted a big housing supply for earlier generations of Americans have been sharply undercut or have disappeared altogether. As a result, young people today watch as the dream of owning their own place or even affording a decent apartment slips away into the mists of fantasy, just not happening. Shortages are everywhere. What kind of housing do we need? Every kind of housing. Housing for first-time home buyers, housing for renters, housing for seniors, housing for people with disabilities, housing for students, housing for reentry housing for those who've been incarcerated, housing for veterans, housing for people who have no homes, manufactured housing communities, rural housing, urban housing, housing for workers, affordable housing, housing for pretty much everyone who doesn't already own a nice big house and is feeling pretty rich. The shortages are real, and we need to grapple with this. So, what can we do? Increase supply, right? It's Econ 101, and we need to face it head on. Nothing gets better if we're wiring around the edges and don't increase the supply of housing. Now, here in Massachusetts, we are very lucky to have a governor who has made it a priority to address the housing crisis head on. Earlier this fall, Governor Healey introduced the Affordable Homes Act, a set of bold policy proposals to boost the supply of housing and drive down housing costs. The Healey-Driscoll administration is working to enable municipalities to pass inclusionary zoning ordinances by simple majorities, reduce barriers to the building of accessory dwelling units, and invest nearly $2 billion directly into housing development. Each of these will help reduce the affordable housing gap. Our governor knows that one size fits all is not going to solve this crisis, but flexible options that help our communities make big, bold choices that work for them is how we'll get more housing. So I just want to start by saying 3 cheers for Massachusetts for tackling the housing crisis head on. Go, Governor Healey, make it happen. But it's not enough. Remember, we need 200,000 new homes, new condos, and apartments in just the next 6 years, not 16 years, the next 6 years. Last year, Massachusetts approved 17,692 housing units. That is not even 1/10 of the units that we need just to get us to a point where we're even. Not where we have excess capacity, but just even. At this rate, we can't even hold steady on this crisis. This crisis will continue to grow. So, here is my pitch today. Massachusetts and the rest of the country should not be left to deal with this housing crisis alone. It is time for the federal government to step up, not to tell local governments what to do, but to be a good partner for communities that are prepared to act. Here's my quick pitch on why the federal government should partner up and take a bigger role in increasing the housing supply. First, the federal government is in the best position to help because it has the power to raise revenue nationally. Look at giant corporations like Amazon that park themselves in states that will give them tax exemptions, but their customer base is nationwide. Massachusetts cannot fix that problem alone. But using money, for example, from my 15% minimum corporate tax on billionaire corporations that were paying nothing in taxes, would enable the federal government to stimulate a bigger housing supply and thereby lower housing costs. And the big corporations that profit from doing business here in the United States should help make that happen. And that will take federal approach to it. Second, the federal government should invest in housing because it connects to many other issues that the federal government directly pays for. We know, for example, that access to adequate housing reduces health care expenses for the Medicaid population. Increasing the supply of affordable housing will reduce money spent in emergency rooms. And third, it really is about our values. For less than 5% of the annual defense budget, for example, we could create a fund that year after year after year could be used to increase and upgrade the supply of housing nationwide. And if we're serious about equity, both generational equity and racial equity, then creating more housing opportunities is a great place to start. So, let me sketch out how we might do this. Once again, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. First step is we need a federal government that is willing to act to increase housing supply. I use my position on the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Development Committee to try to get more funding into housing, but I'll be blunt. It is an uphill battle. Many of our Republican friends and some of our Democratic friends don't want the government in this space. Even so, you don't get what you don't fight for, so I am fighting for a bill to inject more than $40 billion a year into the construction of affordable homes. And now, for just a minute, this is the fun part. Think about how we could use money like that. I'll give you 3 ideas. One is we could create incentives for localities that will modernize their building codes and improve zoning so that the cost of housing declines. Outdated, duplicative building codes and long delays for inspections drive up building costs. So, for example, if a town is willing to change its ordinances to reduce building costs, let's say by 10%, the federal government could offer grants that the town could use to then further cut housing construction costs, or to revitalize downtown, or to rehab other property that the city owns. A win-win for everybody. Or think about how to launch ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units, the extra little space for some of you who are not housing nerds. A modest federal grant could help pay for housing advocates to walk homeowners through the local ordinances and look over plans that have been successfully used elsewhere. Federal dollars could also put a sweetener on the table to cover some of the initial design and construction costs. Another way that we could get more units in more neighborhoods at only a modest part of the federal investment. Or third, consider how federal help might encourage denser and less expensive housing. When public and private developers are putting together a project for housing on land at UMass Lowell, which they're doing, or Hebrew Senior Living, a grant from the federal government for a few $1,000,000 to just expand the number of units in the project could boost the amount of housing available. The price per unit for apartments and condos comes down if we're willing to make even a modest upfront investment. Now, I put those 3 ideas out there. They are not exclusive. There are a lot of people who are coming up with other creative ideas, a lot of approaches we could use. But proposals like this should get us started talking about what is possible. The basic idea is simple. Housing is local, but there is an important role for the federal government to be a good partner to boost housing supply. It's time for us to start building out that role, and I would love nothing more than to start with a pilot project right here in Massachusetts. So that's at least one area. Now, I want quickly to try to hit 2 other areas that I think that we should be talking about when we consider the cost of housing. The first is the increasing power of corporate landlords is now squeezing renters. And while the housing shortage bites deep for families, Wall Street investors have been using it to their advantage. Since the Great Recession, institutional investors have bought up hundreds of thousands of single-family homes, hoovering up a significant chunk of the existing housing supply. Estimates are that by 2030, these big Wall Street firms are expected to own as much as 40% of all single-family rental homes. Now, I'm just going to be blunt. We know how a bunch of these guys operate. They use their immense reserves of wealth and their deal-finding algorithms to swoop into markets and snap up homes that otherwise could have gone to first-time home buyers. For someone selling a home, a corporate all-cash offer is often too sweet to pass up. These corporate groups buy up foreclosed homes in low and middle income properties in bulk. And sometimes they are now buying up entire neighborhood blocks. But it's not just buying up the supply of homes. Once their power is entrenched, there's little stopping corporate landlords from squeezing families for profits. In communities across the country, institutional investors have hiked rents by double-digit margins and jacked up fees while they do no maintenance on the homes and let them fall apart. And as the country struggled under the weight of the pandemic, corporate landlords filed 70,000 evictions on American families in direct defiance of the eviction moratorium. This fall, I sat down with residents at the Sandcastle Estates in Attleboro who have lived this firsthand. After private equity bought up their community, rents jumped 75%. That forced residents, many of whom are seniors on fixed incomes, to choose between staying in their homes or buying food, medication, and other basic necessities. Now, unfortunately, meaningfully addressing the Wall Street investor problem will also require Congress to pass legislation, and once again, Republicans have refused to support investments on the scale of what's needed. But there is hope in this area for more immediate relief. I've called on the Biden administration to use its authority to deliver immediate relief to renters, both from high costs and from greedy investors. And in response, President Biden has revealed a series of federal agency actions and a blueprint for a tenant bill of rights earlier this year. Notably, the Federal Housing Finance Agency used a request for information on a proposal to implement anti-rent gouging measures on federally backed mortgages. It's a step in the right direction. The president also has asked the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, go CFPB. It automatically, when I mention it. And the Federal Trade Commission with collecting information on unfair practices in the rental market to inform their enforcement actions. And then the blueprint for Tenant Bill of Rights provides a framework for renter protections, prioritizing safe and affordable housing, fair leases, protection from discrimination, the right to organize, and eviction prevention. So I get it. This is a big, big problem. Solving this crisis requires creative solutions and persistence from us at all levels of government. So I wanted to be here this morning because you are business leaders, and I am hopeful that you will join me in talking about this issue. Talk about housing and talk about solutions. Let your legislators know that you want to see the Commonwealth make big, bold changes like the ones the governor is proposing. And let your national organizations know that you think the federal government has an important role to play in helping us get more housing nationwide. Help us make the case that affordable housing isn't just a local issue. It's about good business here, good business everywhere. Because I believe that if we work together, we can make those big structural changes that will benefit the Commonwealth and benefit our nation. So thank you all for having me here this morning. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. I think so.
Okay, you tell me. Senator is free to one or two questions, and why don't you just, rather than me, I have my questions, but I want to give you the opportunity to ask a question. And just identify yourself and where you're coming from. So,
You pick 'em, Jim.
Senator. don't.
We got a shy group. I'll start cold calling. Stand up, Joe.
Thank you very much, Senator, and I'm just going to give a little background just by way of context. I know you know me, I know you, but nonetheless, I've headed up the Housing Authority here in Boston. I chair Reparations Task Force for the City of Boston. I'm with the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, and you have been my shero ever since you have been at Harvard. You've read the Consumer
Yeah.
Financial Protection Bureau, et cetera, and you're doing great work in Congress.
Thank you.
I just have-
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate
My
that.
question to you is, you've touched upon an issue. I'm with an organization called Home for Equity, and you've talked about the way that in terms of disparity with regards to African Americans, black persons in this country with regards to housing, wealth, and equity. What we're looking at is trying to use race as a factor in order to be some of the housing assistance programs. Unfortunately, you talk about what the Biden administration is doing, but HUD hasn't played in this game for some time.
Yeah.
What are some of you raising an array of issues this morning, array of ways we can look forward? What do you think that we can do to assist you in what you are attempting to do?
So I so appreciate the question, and I'm gonna give this answer two ways. One is there is a big fight in Washington about ever being able to talk about race in legislation. Right now, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is in a hotly contested fight because they fight discrimination in lending. That's their job. And the way they discover discrimination in lending is they just look at outcomes. They look at what the pool is that you purport to lend in, they look at people's economic circumstances, and then they look at whether or not people were getting mortgages or credit cards, whatever it is, car loans, not car loans because they don't get to do that, mortgages, credit cards, appropriately. In other words, the disparate impact. And when they see that African Americans can't get access to credit, then CFPB comes in. They are under attack. They're under attack in the courts. They're under attack in Congress because Congress wants to make the argument if you can't show that the lender specifically had discriminatory intent, if you can't prove that that lender said, I want to keep African Americans from being able to borrow, then no matter how it actually turns out, it's all okay with them. It's not okay. And I raise that because I want you to understand about what the path looks like as we get this. Obviously, I will continue to fight on that front, and housing very much feeds into this. But I want to make a second point, and that is about how we get some racial equity and generational equity into the system, even without having to use the word race on this. And here's my short version of this. If I had my slides here, I'd click them up at this point. I don't, so I'll just have to dance it, okay? If you go back and start at the beginning, basically, of the 1900s, what you'll see is that America, even in the 1920s, starts subsidizing housing. Only they've got redlining in place. So that means you're subsidizing housing for white families. You are, and by necessity, discriminating against housing for black families because they cannot get access to mortgage money that is federally subsidized. So what happens is we end up, no surprise, with a big black-white wealth gap. And that black-white wealth gap persists all the way. Families are getting richer, black families are getting richer, white families are getting richer. But the gap between black and white stays about the same until 1965. 1965, the United States finally passes the civil rights laws, including the Fair Housing Act, and finally throws out redlining and says no more redlining. And you know what happens? White wealth continues to go up, but black wealth goes up much faster. So the gap starts to narrow. And it looks like we're headed in the right direction. And then what happens? The mortgage crisis of 2008, which in the lead up to it, many of you in the room are very familiar with this, the lead up to it is a handful of financial institutions figured out there was big money to be made from people who already owned their homes, talking them into refinancing out of a secure, stable mortgage that they had. It reduced their monthly payments immediately, but we all know what these things were, that they had these very short periods of low payments and people lost their homes. The lenders who did this perfected it. They came in and perfected it in black communities and somewhat in Latino communities, but principally in black communities, and just stripped black wealth out of those communities. And then they took it nationwide, started costing everybody their homes, and all of a sudden it was a big crisis then. And when that happened and we watched the housing crash in 2008, the rebuilding was to take all of those homes that had been pulled out of communities everywhere, but way disproportionately communities of color, and put them on the market and sell them to whom? Sell them to whoever could come in and bid in giant packages, not to individuals, not to families, but to big corporate entities that invested in these neighborhoods. So the consequence is, you ready for this? What happens to black-white wealth? Well, it's homeownership that's driving this. The gap that had been closing suddenly opens right back up, and that's why I actually had it in my remarks that the gap today between African Americans and whites on wealth driven by housing is back where it was before we passed the civil rights laws in 1965. We are living in America economically, when you look at the race difference, that looks like the Jim Crow era. So I say all that, I know that's a long wind up, but I say all that by way of saying, if we can push support into first-time home buyers, if we can push support into just more housing for everyone. I'm not talking about the classic affordable housing that nobody ever gets to own any part of it, that we fight year after year about whether or not to maintain it. I'm talking about real housing, housing for everybody, everywhere. I'm talking about condos and apartments and single-family homes and duplexes and triple-deckers and every part of this. If we can do that, we have every reason to believe that what will happen is we'll start to close that gap again. In other words, helping everybody on housing most helps those who have been discriminated against for the longest period of time. So that's my vision here. Help me on this, okay? Good.
One more question, because I know she...
I have to catch a plane and go to my favorite place.
You want to identify yourself?
Yeah.
Joseph Strafacek, a huge fan of your work.
Hi, Joseph.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
So I'm a transportation engineer.
Yay!
Bridges, roadways, what have you. And as you know, the Biden administration passed Justice 40. Is there an opportunity you see to take your vision and incorporate it into Justice 40? Because I personally think that there is a way of rebuilding downtowns and connecting these marginalized communities in a way that can not only satisfy your vision, but the vision as a transportation hub as a whole.
So I so appreciate the question. This one I can be much shorter on. Yes. Yes, and yes. And let me just say a word. This speech was already too long, but there was so much I wanted to talk about. But I do want to say on this, if I were doing the longer version of this, the next thing would have been transportation. And a pitch I keep making, I sit on the banking committee, but I make this pitch over and over and over. Transportation is housing and housing is transportation. If we've got a transit system that works, it gets people to their jobs, it actually helps reduce the pressure, if we can build up supply, reduces the pressure on housing and helps us bring down costs. The problem we've got in Massachusetts is we're broken in both directions. We don't have enough housing, and we have a 1955 transit system, and I'm not just talking about in Eastern Mass, I'm talking about all across the state, that doesn't work even at 1955 standards. And we're watching the consequences of decades of underinvestment, decades of not putting in the basic resources so that we have a transit system that gets people everywhere they need. 2 seconds on this. Think how different our entire economy would look in Massachusetts if you could jump on a train down here and the next stop would be Worcester in 48 minutes, and the next stop after that would be Springfield in another 40 minutes. It would fundamentally change the economy, and it would also change housing, because it would change access to housing if people could park and ride. Same is true as you go north and south. I understand that coming to a business group to say taxes means I have the courage to know I'll get out of here with my life. But we do need to pay taxes. We need to pay taxes to make investments in the things that help us build a future for all of us. Otherwise, we just choke. We choke on the traffic. We choke on the fact that you can't hire anybody because they say, I can't afford to buy a house there. We choke on our own success, and then it dies. So my big pitch, this is what I love about being from Massachusetts, is we actually have business leaders, the New England Council, that we have business leaders who actually understand the importance of opportunity for everyone. They understand that investing in our transit, investing in our housing, investing in our education system are the ways that we build security and opportunity for everyone. So yay for mentioning transit. Yes, we should do it. Yes, it is about racial equity. It's about generational equity. And shoot, it's just about building a stronger future. And that's what we need to do. So thank you. Thank you all. Off to DC. Thank you.
Good discussion with our panelists, and I think we've chosen wisely. So with that, Ira's going to say a few words and introduce your panel.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. Thanks for the gracious introduction. Come on, panelists. Come on up. The smartest thing I did when I was chairman of the New England Council was to hire Jim Brett, who runs the most effective regional business organization in the country and has been doing it a spectacular job for 28 years. So let's have a round of applause for the Dean of Regional Business Organizations. We've got a terrific panel. Jim and Sean and the Senator have already framed the issues, so they've stolen much of my thunder, but as we're settling in and grabbing a cup of coffee and a little refreshment, I'll just reset the table a little bit as though the facts that they shared weren't dramatic enough. But maybe to begin, I just wanted to mention that 50 years ago, just 50 years ago, housing prices in Massachusetts and New England were the national average. And we were producing 30,000 units of housing a year. As the Senator conveyed, we're now producing fewer than 15,000 units of housing a year, and the median price of a single-family home in Greater Boston is now in excess of $900,000, which is twice the national average. So you have to earn $300,000 as a family to afford a single-family home in Massachusetts, and I don't know how we survive competitively and economically and socially in terms of other measures of justice unless we tackle this issue with creativity and coordination and partnership. That's why I called for all hands on deck and a housing moonshot. President Kennedy inspired us to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth when there was no business plan available. And he said 60 years ago, we do this not because it's easy, but because it's hard, and we got it done. So I think if we have an all of government and all of industry and all of the Commonwealth kind of commitment, we can yet get this done. But we've got more answers on the panel than my rhetoric and expectations or aspirations. So let me, without further ado, just introduce 5 experts who have collectively more than 100 years of experience in the housing sector. They represent expertise in transportation, which the senator said is just as important as any other element in solving the housing crisis. We have expertise in financing. We have expertise in public-private partnerships, and we have expertise emanating from the community in terms of how we do this equitably with all voices at the table. So without further ado, you have their extensive bios in your QR code. Let me just, I don't even know, I haven't seen what order they're sitting, but why don't we start off with just self-introductions, who you are, what your organization does and contributes, and Todd, why don't you kick things off? Make sure the microphone is right close to your voice. Todd Trehabenko from M&T Capital. Let's get it on.
It's just your water. It's his.
Oh, okay.
Or yours.
So Todd Trehabenko from M&T Capital Management.
Good morning. That's right. Thank you, Ira. Todd Trehabenko, Executive Managing Director of M&T Realty Capital Corporation, and we are the agency lending subsidiary of M&T Bank. M&T is a regional bank serving customers in 12 states, from Maine to Virginia. Some of you may know it was founded in Buffalo back in 1856, and since then has grown to over $200 billion in assets and leading businesses in commercial lending, including commercial real estate lending, as well as retail banking services and trust services. We are growing in New England. It's one of the bank's top priorities in 2024 to maximize its investment and continue growth here. We currently have over 3,600 employees in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, and Connecticut, and over 250 retail banking branches. In all the communities we serve, our goal is to be the hometown bank who can also provide the scale and sophistication of a large financial institution. And we are very committed to those communities. It is really in our culture. We're proud that in every exam since 1982, the bank has scored the highest possible score in the Community Reinvestment Act. I don't think I need to tell anyone here today that the lack of affordable housing is one of the biggest issues, or maybe the biggest issue, in most of the communities that we serve. And I would say, our activities today in terms of supporting affordable housing, I would categorize, put into sort of 4 different groups. One is lending. To date, we've committed more than $2 billion in financing to projects which include affordable housing. And these are loans, traditional bank loans like construction loans or bridge loans, but also augmented by M&T Realty Capital, which I mentioned is the agency lending subsidiary. When I say that, I mean we hold multifamily lending licenses from Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and FHA, and that allows us additional lending products and solutions, including for affordable and workforce housing, that we can bring to our clients. It's actually quite unusual for a bank. I believe there are only 5 banks in the United States that have those licenses. A second way is with respect to direct investment. The bank is a purchaser of low-income housing tax credits and new market tax credits. We can purchase up to $325 million a year. We work with many of the top developers in New England, including Conifer, our host here today. And at the end of last year, the total book value of our LIHTC investment portfolio was over $1.3 billion. Third, community support. We offer financial education to individuals and families in our footprint. We offer home mortgage programs for low and moderate income borrowers, community development loans for nonprofits, and SBA loans to small businesses. We're the top SBA lender in most of the markets we serve, including number 1 in Connecticut, and I believe we're number 6 nationally, although we operate in just 12 states. And then finally, I would say charitable giving and volunteerism. As I said, it's a big part of our culture. So last year, through the M&T Charitable Foundation, we committed more than $47 million to nonprofits throughout the footprint, of which about $25 million was in New England or Eastern Long Island. And our employees collectively volunteered about 159,000 hours working with groups in the community. So I appreciate being here today for this important conversation. I want to thank the New England Council for the invitation and for Senator Warren for joining us to share her thoughts.
Todd, it sounds to me like you're in business here in the region and have a full-service portfolio and commitment to the region. So I'm sure there are members here who will be tapping your expertise. Tavares Brewington is the general counsel of Keolis, which is responsible for our regional commuter rail, and we're delighted to have you on the panel.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I really appreciated the Senator's comments. As was mentioned, I'm the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Keolis North America. A little bit about Keolis. Internationally, we're one of the biggest transit operators in the world. We operate in 13 countries across many modalities. Here in Massachusetts, we run the commuter rail with our partner, the MBTA. But across North America, in January of 2024, we'll have 65,000 employees, and I think we'll be the second largest transit operator in North America. What we seek to do around the housing issue is to really work with our partner clients as they set policy to leverage our global expertise and experience to help them execute that policy. You know, we believe at Keolis that we want transit, public transit, be the preferred mode of transportation because it will have an impact on housing, but it also brings communities together. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, great. Thanks for being with us, Tavares. I'd mention as well that commuter rail, I think, handles some 91,000 daily riders in Massachusetts, and that you're setting a national standard for a return to pre-COVID level use of our commuter rail, which just suggests the incredible demand we have for mass transit well beyond the city limits.
Yeah, that's correct. We here in Massachusetts, our recovery rate is the highest in the nation, and that is really a credit to the partnership with the MBTA and the work that our team at Keolis is doing.
We're delighted to have you with us, Tavares. Soni Gupta is Director of Housing and Neighborhoods for the Boston Foundation, which is the community's leading foundation that's focused on our civic agenda. Soni, welcome.
Thank you, Ira, and thank you to the New England Council for having the Boston Foundation represented on this panel. As Ira said, the Boston Foundation is the community foundation for the greater Boston region. And the focus of the foundation, it's over 100 years old. The focus is on addressing some of the greatest disparities in our region, and needless to say, housing is one of the most significant ones. We look at creating pathways for residents of Greater Boston to have more opportunities in a range of ways. And we also focus on supporting communities in the Greater Boston region to be thriving and everything that their residents are seeking them to be. We do this primarily in three ways, and I'm just delighted that Senator Warren gave the most amazing, succinct history of Boston and the challenges and some of the inequities in our region. But our focus is really on increasing supply, so putting our weight behind policy advocacy research that convinces the region and all of the residents in the region that we need more supply and the various ways that we can achieve that. And the Senator outlined some of those. We also work on increasing affordability and preventing displacement for residents who might be in lower income and communities of color, such as in the city of Boston and also in gateway cities. And we help lower income households build assets through a range of programs that are available to renters, homeownership supports, including some of the first generation homeownership, and Ken's going to talk about more homeownership as well. But we're engaged very deeply on the housing issues and love to get into more details in our conversation.
Thank you, Soni. I'd mention to those not from Boston, we're privileged to have the Boston Foundation as our community foundation, but virtually every community throughout New England has a community foundation, and they too are repositories of analytic insight and capital investment and convening authority. I'd also mention again, so that we're not too Boston-centric, that this housing crisis, as Senator Warren emphasized, is a national problem, but it's also a regional problem. New Hampshire has identified the need for 90,000 new units of housing. The governor of Connecticut has said that there are only 4,000 single-family homes on the market today. There need to be 15,000 units of housing on the market today, and there's a need for 100,000 new workers in Connecticut. The governors of Maine and Vermont have also been championing public policies around affordable housing because this is an acute regional issue. So thank you, Sony. This is Sony, and the work of the Boston Foundation is preeminent, and they're a pioneering institution, but other foundations across New England are doing similar work. Next in line is an incredible talent, Ken Willis, who I've known for many years. We used to work at Bank Boston together when that was an institution that existed, the oldest commercial bank in America, and he's now the Senior Vice President of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, Bank of Boston. And Ken, good to have you on the panel.
Thank you, Ira, and most talented. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So yes, as Ira mentioned, I'm Ken Willis, Senior Vice President at the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston. There's a lot of words there to the name of the bank, but essentially we're a wholesale bank. So I think many folks, or maybe many folks, are not aware of the Federal Home Loan Bank, but we are a wholesale bank. We're one of 11 banks that provide really two core missions. The first part of our mission really is about providing fundamental liquidity for banks, credit unions, insurance companies, even CDFIs, so that they can engage and continue to do the lending that they do, whether that be residential lending, small business lending, commercial real estate lending. We provide them with the liquidity that allows them to do that. So that's central to what we do. But secondarily and equally important is affordable housing and economic development. And so the bank implements a variety of different programs to support both rental home ownership as well as home ownership as well. And I was really heartened by the senator's comments around sort of racial equity and the wealth gap and what that really represents. But before I really dive into that too deeply, I do just want to mention that we implement programs that really support all of our members. So everything that we do through our affordable housing program, which allocates subsidies for the production and preservation of rental housing and affordable housing. We also implement a variety of down payment and closing cost assistance programs. So that's really that back-end money that home buyer needs to close the gap that we just heard about, from the senator. It's that critical gap funding that brings the affordability somewhat back in line. And then a host of economic development programs for commercial real estate and small business lending. And I hope we get more into this conversation, but I really want to just shout out one of the programs that we're implementing currently today. It's called Lift Up Home Ownership, and it really speaks to exactly what the senator mentioned. There is a significant racial home ownership gap and wealth gap in this country, particularly in Massachusetts. And so a couple of years ago, the bank sought out ways in which we could sort of help to close this gap. And I'm pleased to say that after 2 years of working with the Joint Center for Housing Studies, getting all the data and analytics, we were able to launch a special purpose credit program, which is governed by the CFPB. I'm surprised I didn't hear that earlier, but essentially it allows for a financial institution to really address some of the issues that the senator mentioned, whether that be redlining, folks not having enough cash to make the down payment. And so what it does is it allows us to set aside a portion of our earnings to this down payment program where folks of color can use that money to support their down payment and closing costs. And so, again, governed by the CFPB, it allows us to really hit a target and really help to close that racial homeownership gap. And happy to really talk more about that as we get into the conversation. So thank you. Thank you to the New England Council for letting me be here today. And I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Great. Lift Up Home Ownership. Hadn't heard of it before. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Ken. Batting cleanup, we've already heard from him before. He's a proud UMass graduate on multiple levels. Sean Carpenter, Regional Vice President of Conifer.
Yeah, good morning again. I'm not going to reintroduce myself, so maybe I'll take 30 seconds to mention some of our partners that are in the room that are doing this. I mean, obviously we do deals with M&T Bank, and we've had some great relationships with the Federal Home Loan Bank all over the country, whether at Atlanta, New York, Indianapolis, but also our friends over at Boston Financial and Redstone Equity Partners and TD Bank and Webster Bank, all in the room today. And it takes a lot of people to put these deals together. And one thing I just want to point out is that, we heard from the former head of the Boston Housing Authority here this morning asking a question. But when you go outside of the larger cities and you go into some of the suburbs and some of the regions and some of the counties in New England, the knowledge around housing is not exactly there. So it's really up to people in the business community to educate and advocate and implement new programs that are unique and creative that can help these communities not just deal with a crisis on their hands and just try to make it up, but we've got to, and this is why the Boston Foundation is so critical to this piece of bringing everybody together to understanding the analytics, as Ira says, but also the outcomes are very big for economic development purposes in each and every community that we serve.
So thanks, Sean. Why don't we pivot from that observation to my asking you and anyone else on the panel, what's the role of zoning as an impediment to housing development, and what's the solution to NIMBYism that's preventing our taking advantage of opportunities throughout the region?
Yeah, it's so I told Ira this was like the number one issue before we started this panel. Like, there's two processes to building housing in the United States, but particularly here in New England, this is true, or at least been my experience. Is you have a process of trying to get a property entitled. You could go years and years and years. In fact, if anybody here reads the Wall Street Journal, you'll see an article from Friday about a 17-year process of trying to get a deal in LA entitled and then funded and then opened. I haven't gone 17 years on any deal, but we've had a few that have gone 4, 5, 6 years. And a lot of that has to do with the communities not understanding that the housing that we develop, be it rental housing or homeownership or whatever the case may be, is for people's children to live and work in the communities that they grew up in. They can no longer afford to live in the city of Boston or the Somerville or Quincy or wherever, because housing has just gone through the roof. So if we can advocate to zoning boards and planning boards that we're bringing in housing that's rent restricted to keep housing cost burdens low, we can increase supply but also allow people to stay here and build these communities. And it's a huge problem because folks think the worst when they think of affordable housing, but really what we're trying to do is be change agents and let everybody think the best about affordable housing, because we know when every major business introduces themselves to Boston or Hartford or Portland or any of these resort communities, we know that the number one issue that those organizations are going to have is where are their workers going to live. And you don't have to look much further than Cape Cod in the summer and wonder why you have to wait 45 minutes for a table because there's no workers there because the workers can't afford to live in Cape Cod. And so we need to do more as a business community. We need to do more as housing advocates and community organizations to really build ways and bridges to these communities to say, this is actually helping you, not hurting you. We're not bringing down your school system. We're building up your school system. We're diversifying the school system. We're creating real opportunities for your children and your grandchildren. So that's my high horse.
Well, the argument has worked recently in Lexington and Brookline, but others on the panel, can they contribute to, we're all in violent agreement about a crisis that jeopardizes our economic future and the quality of life that we uniquely enjoy as New Englanders. We want a diverse community. We want our kids to be able to live here. How come we can't convince our friends and neighbors in the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts and in communities throughout New England to allow for zoning changes that would allow and accelerate the development and production of housing? Others on the panel have ideas and recommendations or examples of where it's worked and how we can be more effective in our advocacy at the local level with our friends and neighbors?
Yeah, actually, Ira, I'll jump in here. In response to NIMBY, which everybody knows is not in my backyard, there is a movement called YIMBY, which is Yes in My Backyard. It's a national movement. We have an organization here in Massachusetts called Abundant Housing. That's very much a YIMBY organization that actually has coordinators and organizers who are working with municipalities to help them understand the benefits of creating all kinds of housing. So Senator Warren, I mean, really, she couldn't have set this up better. Of course, that's her incredible expertise.
She's pretty good at that.
She's pretty good at that. She talked about building all kinds of homes, every kind of home that we could possibly need, but our zoning codes are so old, and there's a history to our zoning. She talked about redlining. That's only one part of the way that housing discrimination took place. Zoning is another very discriminatory impact. It has discriminatory impact on housing and access, and I think more communities that are willing to look at their zoning to respond to today's need for more housing across the board, and to open their communities, in particular, to households with children, which is it's an incredible kind of pushback you can get when you propose larger development, larger size units with more bedrooms. It's as if children are little villains, and that must be kept out of communities. So changing zoning in response to the needs of housing today, making it easier to create housing that's not just single family homes on a single acre lot or a 2 acre lot, and being more open, just everybody in the communities that you might live, participating in the planning process and the building code process to keep that in mind, that we have an intense housing shortage, 200,000 units in 6 years. We're nowhere near that rate of development that we need to be, and we all need to just pull our weight.
Thank you, Sonny. Tavares, you're sitting on many opportunities in transit hubs and elsewhere. How can we take advantage of greater opportunities with the MBTA Communities Bill and others, to do multifamily units where they're needed most in downtown clusters, in gateway cities and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, again, as an operator, we really don't set policy, but we know what works.
Sure you do.
Based on our experience. When you think
Just a
about,
little closer to the mic, please. Is that on? Yeah.
when you think about transit-oriented development, as we've all said here today, it enables economic mobility by connecting affordable, areas to jobs, education, critical services, and professional development. But really, transportation impacts, everyone across the economic spectrum. When you think about it, the two biggest costs for most families is housing and transportation. Our research shows that about approximately 25 million Americans across the United States live in a transportation desert. 19% of those families, live below the poverty line. The consequence of that is they're paying a lot more in transportation costs. I think the latest number I heard actually this morning is that the average cost with the inflationary pressures for a car lease is $726 a month. Right?
Wow.
So transportation is really important. Not only that, when we talk about affordable housing, when we look at dense, repopulated areas, having transit options is critical to even being able to produce the capacity in the inventory of affordable housing. About 25 to 30% of most developments are dedicated to parking, which means you can build less units, and each unit, the construction cost is much more, right? So it's a critical impact in that area as well. Also in densely populated areas, when you think about traffic patterns, right? If you have a high reliance on automobiles in a densely populated area, traffic is a challenge, and the impact on the environment is really is not great as well. And we've seen, throughout the world, in terms of the systems we operate, that really transit-oriented development having a huge impact on quality of life, on affordable housing, and so we seek to work with our partners to implement the things that we know work.
Great. Ken, last week, Chairman Powell had some words about the future and maybe 3 rate decreases next year, and mortgage rates suddenly went from over 8% to below 7% for the first time in more than 2 years. Have we turned the corner? Is that a little light at the end of the tunnel? I see our perfect storm has started to abate outside our window. Is this an opportunity that you and others can now take advantage of?
I mean, certainly, I'm not going to get into the business of projecting rates and when they go up and when
Really?
they go down. No.
That would be really helpful.
Yeah, wish I knew the answer to that. But let's, under the context, if rates do decrease, I mean, yes, if they come down 25, 50, maybe 75 basis points, obviously that's going to open up affordability, right? I mean, mortgage rates become more affordable. People's incomes relative to the cost of affording a mortgage become more realistic. And so, yes, to the extent that rates decrease, you know, the subsidy that we provide in down payment and closing cost assistance has better leverage and thus can get more folks into homes. So to the extent that that happens, that's great. You know, if, rates come down a little bit and the actual cost of constructing, you know, we support member financial institutions who make all of these construction loans, right? To the extent that they can lower their cost of construction to the developers, you know, that trickles down into the overall total development cost of a unit. So there's definitely a correlation. You know, the question is when. And, you know, I'm not in a position to really say when that's going to happen, but it would be beneficial to our industry in terms of producing and preserving more affordable housing.
Great. Todd, we're talking about a housing crisis and a lack of supply and production, but there's an excess of commercial office vacancies right outside our window, and in downtown Hartford and Portland and Providence, and probably even in Burlington, Vermont. Is this an opportunity that we should be looking at creatively in terms of converting some of this vacant commercial office space into residential housing?
Well, I think it's a very interesting proposition, real estate developers are incredibly creative. You see there, John, how you're doing? And there's a long history of creating housing out of other building types, mill buildings, schools, hotels, retail, you name it. And I think those of us up here, we've seen all of that. I've been involved in some office conversions pre-COVID. Downtown Hartford, working with the Capital Region Development Authority. Their mission is to help revitalize downtown Hartford. And we were able, working with my client, we were able to convert a 26-story office tower to 286 units of housing right on Main Street in Hartford. It's a mixture of market rate units and affordable units. And, you know, it can be done. I think it's expensive. In this case, you know, CRDA put in some secondary financing. They also put some equity in the deal. The Connecticut Department of Housing contributed to the deal in addition to the construction. So, you know, I think if you're talking about scaling, it's unfortunately much more difficult. Thank you.
There we go. Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So if we're talking about scaling, it's much more difficult.
So it can contribute, but it's not likely to be a silver bullet.
Well, if you look at the building we're in, for example, and
Yes.
if you're a real estate developer, you need to create apartment units. You want apartment units that have natural light. Maybe you need operable windows, you know, for code. You need to get a kitchen and bathroom in every unit, right? The typical office building might have a communal kitchen and 2 or 3 sets of restrooms on the floor, and it's very challenging and very expensive. So I think you'll see some, but in terms of being a solution, you know, scaled in that volume, I think unfortunately it's more of a boutique situation.
Sony, how can we ensure that community voices are at the table and offering creative, collaborative solutions to financiers and developers and federal programs and state programs? How can we ensure that that's part of the mix and the equity as part of the solution?
Yeah, I'd like to pick on something again that Senator Warren spoke about, which is the acquisition of existing housing by speculative buyers and investors. And she said it's leading up to some projected to be 40% of ownership is leading up to it. And we have very good examples of interventions in that here in our region. The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is one of the oldest community land trusts where residents came together to collectively own what was the Dudley Triangle in Roxbury and take ownership and take back that community so that they could stop the blight, the arson, the disinvestment, and some of the dramatic impacts that they were seeing. And that movement of community land trusts is really nationwide, has taken root. There's a growth of community land trusts in our region as well. We have land trusts in Boston, but also in Somerville, in Chelsea, and other cities. And we have an incredible network of community development corporations. I see Andrew's not looking up, now he is, who do amazing work in their communities. They have representatives, residents who are on their boards, who have a voice. And community land trusts, too, are governed by community residents. And it's a way of intervening in this market action where speculative buyers and investors are taking over ownership. We at the foundation are paying a lot of attention to this. The acquisition strategy, the City of Boston has also invested funds in helping nonprofit owners intervene in acquisitions and, giving them funding so that they can compete with the more resource-rich buyers who are coming up to the market. So we think it's a really important way of community ownership, community voice, really lending itself in housing. And I'll say more broadly around community voice, there are municipalities that have done a lot of good work in ensuring that more people can, more diverse folks can really weigh in on things like housing development and planning boards and zoning meetings. We have a research report that looked at some of the work that the City of Newton did, where they realized that when they have open meetings around housing and zoning, that the representation is not very diverse. It typically is a longtime homeowner, doesn't
White.
include, yes, white, longtime homeowner, doesn't include people of color, doesn't include renters, doesn't include lower income residents. And that one way to capture those voices is to have focus groups that are directly for those communities. And they found that when they did those focus groups, that the support for housing development and housing production was completely the opposite. They got the opposite responses than they did when they had open meetings. So there are ways to engage communities that are more inclusive, and would be happy to sort of, if folks want to look at that report, it's on our website. But just having open meetings doesn't invite the same kind of diverse opinions and voices that you would like to.
So this is an example of best practice, which many of us can take advantage of.
That's right.
The Housing Trust is doing amazing work in East Boston and elsewhere. And if you don't mind my putting you on the spot, Sony, I assume that our members and the audience here can get in touch with you and others at the Boston Foundation, because this is a thicket and a myriad of programs to navigate a very tricky space, but expertise like yours makes it more accessible.
Absolutely, we'd be delighted to.
And you as well, Ken, have enormous experience in putting together public-private partnerships. Can you give us a sense, a little inspiration for where it's working and how more of us in this room can participate in being part of the solution?
Yeah, certainly, absolutely. I mean, I think, when you talk about public-private partnerships, I mean, that is exactly what we do at the bank. All of the programs that we use to support the production and preservation of affordable housing, and also supporting down payment and closing cost assistance, really is done through our member institutions. So it's the banks, the credit unions, the CDFIs that are in your local neighborhoods that we're facilitating. We're helping them to provide these resources to the communities. So on a banking level, we're really facilitating those programs. But everything that we do when we think about affordable housing is, a public-private partnership. As Sean mentioned, to build an affordable housing development, it takes sometimes 8, 10, 12 different sources of funding. By definition, you need to partner, right? So partnerships are being established as you begin to put your capital stack together for these developments. And so I think what can really be had with a public-private partnership is really about speed to market and execution, right? Sony mentioned CDCs and the grassroots work that they do in communities, but we have Conifer, which is a mission-oriented developer. They have the capital, the resources, the scale to go to market quickly, right? So when you combine the scalability and flexibility and speed of market for a mission-oriented private developer with a mission-driven CDC, such as DSNI or Madison Park CDC, name a CDC, you get the best of both worlds. And what that really translates into, I always call it the double bottom line, right? We want to make sure we can build and preserve communities, but at the same time, building affordable housing is a business, right? There needs to be returns on investments to investors. So you can do both. You can provide necessary returns to those that are building affordable housing at the same time, recognizing, maybe taking a little bit less, on the return so that you can have a more sustainable development model for the community. So I say all that to say that public-private partnerships are at the heart of really, putting together a deal.
That's great, Ken. And by public-private partnerships, you include hospitals and higher education institutions and even other nonprofits, as you mentioned.
Absolutely.
So it's not limited to business, that you're prepared to help put together creative and effective and cost-effective financing for, right?
If I could maybe provide an example as well. I mean, we're the bank for all of New England, and specifically, we had a transaction in Vermont where the local hospital actually contributed, I think, close to $1 million to the development of a homeless shelter. And what that translated into was less visits to the hospital, right? So there was this economic impact of their investment. So that's a classic sort of public-private partnership that benefits both parties.
Thank you, thank you. So Sean and Todd, from a private sector capital markets developer perspective, give us a couple of examples where this works. Sunday River, you mentioned in passing, Sean.
Yeah,
So give us a little bit more texture to that.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to point out that we haven't even started a deal with Ken yet, and he's already cutting my fee. You notice how he just snuck in there. We're going to take a little bit less, just a little bit less. I'll give you an example, a great example. It took 10 years to close a deal, 265 rent-restricted units in Hempstead, New York. We closed it in March of this year. The outlay from Conifer was $8 million. Redstone Capital, Redstone Partners closed that with us with TD Bank, and we were able to get some of that, not all of that, back. So thinking about that just as a development standpoint, for 8 years fighting zoning and all those other things, and then trying to get
That's
the
a
funding.
long slog.
Yeah, and like cobbling together all the different funding sources. It's got like 6 or 7 funding sources with tax credits and Affordable Housing Trust Fund and Federal Housing Trust Fund and all that. So all of that on these low income developments, somebody has to put cash out there. And, when we're talking about some of the CDCs that are in the room, I mean, they don't have that kind of capital because they have to raise that money. That money, is not it's just not readily available because they're constantly out in the street doing the work and doing the grassroots effort. I know I saw my friend Donald in the back here from Caribbean Integration Community Development, who we've done some business with. If you haven't seen the Dorchester newspaper, you'll see him in there leading a grassroots effort at Soma Apartments, where we're trying to help him develop or keep a bunch of units, like 200 units, trying to keep them affordable for the residents there without getting a skyrocketing rent increase. It's happening, and it's not just here in Massachusetts, it's happening all over the place. But, we take Sunday River, for example. Sunday River has people represented in Western Maine. Over 50 school districts, their employees are represented. I mean, if you know how big the school districts are in Maine. But they need housing just so folks in snowstorms aren't driving an hour and a half with high gas prices to get to work, and they can't afford to be there, so they call in sick, and then the lifts don't run, and then everybody in this room is angry. Then you can't get your waffle when you're going into the Barker lift. But to put that together, we need a little bit more creative. We need private enterprises that want to invest in the housing and get a lower rate of return, as Ken says. So maybe they don't get a 20% or a 30% or 3x or 4x that they might get from oil and gas, but maybe some ESG investing into some of our attainable housing product we can give them, 100, 200 units of housing, and Sunday River becomes a larger employer. And it's not just Sunday River. We've had these conversations down in Cape Cod and, out in the Connecticut shore, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, so I would just add, Ken mentioned Vermont. I spent a lot of time up in Burlington. Vermont as a whole may be losing population or stable in population, but in Burlington and Williston, Chittenden County, there's apartment vacancy, market-wide, county-wide, is probably less than 1.5%. And it's a huge issue for the UVM Medical Center. They can't retain nurses. They've been paying visiting nurses, 2x or 3x what you would pay staff because there's the shortage of housing. So they are starting to joint venture. The University of Vermont is joint venturing to build housing with a private developer. And I will mention, one of the group that we work very closely with at M&T Bank called Evernorth. They're a nonprofit housing developer and housing intermediary. They serve Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Very creative people. They have started a fund. They've raised a fund that is capitalized with investments by 8 employers in the Windsor County, Vermont. So that think Woodstock and Grafton County, New Hampshire. So think Dartmouth. And it's a $9 million fund where the purpose of that fund is for Evernorth to then use those monies as equity to leverage to leverage federal resources and state resources to create 250 units of housing that's affordable to workers making between $13 and $25 an hour.
Wow.
So it's Dartmouth Health, it's Hanover Co-op food stores, it's King Arthur Baking, and they just know that they cannot continue to run their business in these areas if their employees cannot afford to live even close to the community, let alone in the community.
Another example of innovative collaboration driven by desperation and necessity. So I think we're all in agreement that we're facing an existential crisis, and it requires all hands on deck. I'm going to wrap things up. We wanted to provide time for questions from the audience, but time is limited, and I want to get everybody on the panel to offer some final concluding observations about what would they like the government to do, either the state or the federal government. We heard from Senator Warren about what she'd like from the federal government. What would be the most useful thing from your perspective from government? What's the most useful thing that an institution like yours can do a little differently to get better results? And then, if you have any recommendations to those of us who are just individuals in this market, how can we contribute to the solution? So, Todd, you're first up.
Well, I think it's all about supply. So I think a doubling down of what works would be most effective.
Doubling down on what works.
The
That's
most
pretty good.
effective housing production program is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. It's produced over $3.5 million units of housing since 1987. It's administered by the IRS. It's not even administered by a housing agency. That housing serves generally people that are below 50% or 60% of AMI. I'm struck by the predecessor programs that were run by HUD served people originally at 80. So I think more tax credits both on the low income side, but also workforce housing, 80% of AMI, or maybe even higher in some locations.
Okay, more tax credits.
I'm going to just give you one last thought. So Fannie and Freddie, they're regulated by FHFA. They have for their workforce program a list of 30 extremely high cost markets around the country. A third of them are in New England.
Wow.
All right, so I'll answer this question in 2 ways, one with my corporate hat and one with a personal kind of perspective. From the Keolis and the transportation side, I think what the government can do is invest in reliable and safe transit. Senator Warren mentioned that, connecting people in places, making it so that everyone wants to ride public transportation. You can have the CEO of a company and the person working in an entry-level role riding together on the transit because it's the best option, it's the quickest option, it's the most affordable option. So I think all that we can do to continue to invest in the infrastructure is really important. The personal side. For me, as a person that's lived in Boston for a while and in the United States, I think a lot of times when we talk about affordable housing, the need is acute, but it really is a symptom of something else, right? Lack of opportunity to engage in the economy at optimal levels, right? And I think as individuals, what we can do to help as well is to make sure that everybody has a chance, right, to engage in the economy, to afford housing. And so some of those things I think we can all focus on, independent of the government, in our personal lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tavares. Soni?
Well, I'm going to take Tavares' cue. Personal and professional for me is actually transit, because as the senator said again, transit is housing, housing is transit, and housing justice and housing equity is very closely linked to transit. Delighted about the MBTA legislation, which has the capacity to have more housing around transit. We won't get affordability even for middle-income households until we build more housing of all kinds. And I think affordability comes from subsidies, tax credit program, but we need more housing overall. And even for the state rental voucher to work, we need more housing. We don't have enough housing to attach that voucher to in order to create affordability. So for the state, I'd say just focus on tenant protections, like funding the rental voucher program, funding the RAFT program that protects people from losing their homes, fund right to counsel for tenants, and fund the Tenant Option to Purchase Act, which gives tenants the opportunity to purchase their properties when it's up for sale.
Thank you, Soni. Ken?
Yeah, I agree with my panelists. I mean, I really can't add much more. I mean, we definitely need to increase resources. I think the senator laid it out. We need creative, innovative solutions to the problem. So certainly producing more affordable housing, investing more resources. I think tenant protections is key. But I do want to focus on the racial equity piece. I know the senator spent quite a bit of time sort of giving us the history. Having been born and raised in this state, I've seen it personally, and I think really thinking about, the fact that, there is this great disparity amongst people of color in terms of, equity, racial homeownership equity, as well as wealth. And so that was the whole purpose of us starting the special purpose credit program, right? To try to at least, sort of even it out a little bit. And I think we heard clearly that, all of our wealth, most Americans' wealth, are in the homes that they own. You can leverage it to start a small business. You can retire. You can send your kids to college. Everything really stems from that. And so the more we can do from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, I think we want to focus on that. In terms of maybe helping the nonprofit community, I can tell you that we're looking at putting together a program that would help CDCs and mission-driven developers like Conover have access to quick strike capital. We heard about the 40% of the single-family homes being owned by Wall Street. That's because CDCs don't have the capital to move quickly. We're actually working on a product that would allow a CDC to actually compete with Wall Street investors, so they have an opportunity to preserve that piece of property. So I put that under the context of sort of creative and innovative solutions, and listening and talking about it, because if you don't talk about it, it doesn't get addressed. So
That's great.
Thank you for the opportunity to
Quick
present.
start.
Yep.
Quick start capital. I've never heard that
Quick
term.
strike.
Quick strike. I'm sorry, I couldn't read my own handwriting. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yep. All right.
Sean?
Yeah, I like that one. But, as you heard earlier, and I was pleased to hear Senator Warren say that she was all in on AHCIA. I mean, that's really important to expand and extend those programs that have been around since 1986. But every member of Congress, think about the Senate. The Senate, we could probably pass that. But the House, who, has trouble electing a speaker, it doesn't want to be in session. They're losing out because each and every district that they go home and represent, they're hearing the number one issue is affordable housing. And, so we're trying to be creative in one of the things I just want to go back to is advocate and educate on housing is so important. One of the pieces of legislation that we just filed in the New York Assembly not NIMBY or YIMBY, it's called YIGBY, Yes in God's Backyard. We're working with churches
Yeah,
around the state
fantastic.
of New York to use their excess land to develop housing on there and to support those parishes and whatnot throughout the state of New York. We'll probably file similar legislation in Massachusetts, and with the housing bond bill that they're going to pass here with $4 billion, that's 40,000 units in Massachusetts.
passed, yeah.
If it gets passed, and it should get passed, right? There's really no reason not to pass it here, because it will only boost Massachusetts' economy. But we could do that with churches here in Massachusetts and all over New England. Rhode Island's poised to support similar legislation, and So anyway, educate and advocate for housing, and that the tides will turn. And if we can limit the amount of money and the expenditures that developers spend sitting in planning board and zoning board and all these other rooms, and reduce our legal costs, sorry, lawyers in the room, we can reduce that, and we can then go forward and spend more time on these collaborative programs to create more effective financing solutions that make for lower rents.
Great.
In perpetuity.
I think I promised that there was lots of wisdom as well as experience on the panel, and I think they've demonstrated it. So please join me in thanking Sony and Todd and Tavares and Ken and Sean. I want to thank Jim Brett and Griffin Doherty for bringing us together. I think this is the most important issue facing our region. Jim, with all due respect to all the other important issues that are facing our region, Senator Warren obviously got us off to a great start. She's passionate. As she says, policy is her love language. We learned a lot. I did, listening to her. We've got a lot of expertise on the panel, and they've come up with creative ideas. I think without preaching or teaching, and I am a teacher, I think there's a role for all of us to play. Problem solving begins with recognition and then engagement. I think it's, as the senator said, an all hands on deck moment. And if we follow Sean's dictums of owning this issue and being creative and collaborative and advocating for this issue, today can represent an important, maybe inflection point and a call to action for all of us. Thank you so much.